Imagine an electric railroad that once stretched over 180 miles from Oakland to Chico, California. That would be this Sacramento Northern that ended in a tiny yard in a cramped residential area. This is one topic of our much longer Electric Rails Around the Bay DVD production.
We moved to Contra Costa County in the 50s and find an electric railway operation that survived due to a weakness of its parent company, the Western Pacific. This train has passed through Moraga and Valley Vista. Soon, spots on the map such as Pinehurst and Canyon would be passed on the way to Eastport, where a 3,200-foot-long tunnel pierced the Contra Costa and Alameda County border. The train has followed the San Leandro Creek into a narrowing canyon that has seen little development since it has always been watershed territory. On the other side of the tunnel was Shepherd Canyon, the communities of Montclair, Rock Ridge, and finally Oakland itself. Electric trains ran through the Oakland Hills from 1913 to the end in 1957. This is the south end of a 185-mile-long Sacramento Northern Railway. The Sacramento Northern, or SN, ran a passenger service until mid-1941. After that, they concentrated on a growing freight business. The parent of Sacramento Northern was the Western Pacific, shown in orange. The yellow line was built by the Oakland and Antioch to tap into the population of Contra Costa County and its agriculture. The related Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern built the line north of Suisun Bay to Sacramento, the capital of California. The Northern Electric Railway was built from Sacramento to Marysville, Yuba City, Oroville, and finally Chico. This became the north end of the Sacramento Northern, when all these lines from Oakland up to Chico were consolidated in 1929. The SN became an important feeder line of the Western Pacific. The north end always had its own look and heritage. One important branch line was the Colusa branch, shown here. This presentation will concentrate on the south end of the Sacramento Northern and will start our tour from Oakland, California. Long electric trains with parlor cars and dining facilities once ran up Shafter Avenue in early Oakland days, linking travelers to points north in style and speed. If you wanted to ride to Walnut Creek, Concord, or even Sacramento, this was a fast, convenient, and scenic way to do it. The equipment was the best available, and the south end featured modern block signaling for safety. Finding a direct way into Oakland placed the line down a residential street that crossed busy College Avenue. These were big, heavy interurban cars that operated trains to steam road standards. Scraping a fender or two and the panic of many near misses didn't make many friends along Shafter Avenue. The residents along this line never cared much for the tracks near their front yards and the accompanying noise. This is Train 17, a local from Concord, nearing the Oakland stop at the 40th and Shafter station. In spite of the local residents' feelings, the SN had many supporters and fans that ran excursions long after the end of regular passenger service. Number 1005 was the belle of the ball on many special runs over SN and key system tracks during the 50s. In the early days, the small yard in Oakland was home to a great variety of passenger and freight equipment. The 1003 class had members up to 1018, and Holman, Wasson, and Cincinnati Car Company built these units before World War I. This crowded scene shows Wasson built 1014, a Niles-built car, and a Hall Scott number 1022, all spilling out onto 40th Street from the cramped yard area. This wood-bodied freight motor, parked at 40th and Shafter, was under lease to the Oakland Terminal Railway until increased freight business required heavier power. The Oakland terminal ran freight trains down Key System's Piedmont C line. You can see the Sacramento Northern facility in the background as a Key System train heads for San Francisco down 40th Street. This diagram of the Key System's 40th Street C line shows the Sacramento Northern station and yard area crammed into a 1.5 square block area. When the SN ran passenger trains, it had trackage rights down the Key System's C line to the pier and ferry boats. By 1939, the SN trains used the Bay Bridge to carry its passengers to the San Francisco terminal. SN trains came down from the Oakland Hills to the 40th and Shafter station under 1500-volt power and changed over to the Key System's 600-volt power to use the C line on the way to the Bay Bridge. SN freight trains were handed over to the Oakland Terminal Railway. The Western Pacific and Santa Fe bought the Oakland Terminal, owned by the Key System, in 1943 as a freight connection into the Oakland Army Base. The Key System tracks crossed under the Southern Pacific tracks, shown in red. This Baldwin Westinghouse unit was one of two that was leased for this freight connection between the SN and the OT. The OT would typically pick up trains from the westbound SN trains using leased number 440 and 442 electric locomotives. The olive drab flat car load guarantees that the crew will make a trip to the Oakland Army Base. Some of the other loads would be dropped off at various industries in Oakland's manufacturing district. While the OT handled the freight transfers, the SN's passenger trains had trackage rights to use the subway under SP tracks to head west to the Bay Bridge. The west and eastbound tracks split up at the bridge yard. This is the westbound track. An SN train runs east under the SP tracks. Down the line are some Key System shops to the right, and the Santa Fe's terminal was to the left. This westbound has a Wasson built on the point, followed by a Hall Scott and two former Northern Electric arch-windowed Niles cars. An SN combination with trailer is on the San Francisco Loop. Inside the terminal, passengers will hop off and take the ramp down to ground level and catch waiting San Francisco municipal streetcars to their final destinations. The train will then gather up eastbound passengers and head back out on the loop to recross the bay on the bridge. Due to declining ridership, the SN couldn't wait to abandon the passenger business and concentrate on freight. Freight traffic was up during the Second World War, and after a lull, it climbed again during the Korean War. Eliminating the passenger traffic in 1941 helped relieve some of the crowding at the cramped and somewhat run-down SN Oakland Yard. The SN was now a freight feeder of the Western Pacific. The parent WP had no easy way to reach the Oakland Army Base and many other customers in Oakland. Transferring loads at Sacramento to SN trains solved this inconvenience. As 661 heads out to assemble a morning eastbound on Shafter Avenue, we see in the background a small railfan crowd beginning to board number 1005 for a fan trip. Several passenger units were used for business and occasional railfan excursion trains until the end. Parked in the 40th and Shafter Yard is a portion of the mainline locomotive roster, 3 GE-built units and a Baldwin Westinghouse. These were all part of the Northern Electric before the merger. Most of the SN's fleet was dual voltage capable, since the north end ran on 600 volts DC. The yard here was energized at 600 volts to allow the Oakland terminal trains to work the area. Most of the SN's power had a trolley pole, pantograph, and outside third rail shoes for maximum flexibility. As the morning eastbound is assembled on Shafter Avenue, you can see all the seesawing activity required to place the head-in power, tack on the freight cars, and assemble a caboose and rear pusher locomotive on the end. Today's train will be headed by a 1927-built number 661 that weighed in at 137,000 pounds. Watch the somewhat crazy driving with autos pulling off last-moment squeeze-bys. This was the norm here, and SN crews had to be watchful and patient. The last move is the rear pusher and caboose running up to the rear of the train on Shafter Avenue. The rule was to have power on both ends to avoid a train brake accident on the 4% grade ahead. This rule dated back to the beginning to satisfy Oakland City safety concerns. The arrow shows our viewing angle. Imagine an unchecked cut of cars roaring down Shafter into the small yard in this city location. Looking up Shafter, we see a westbound nearly into the terminal. Shafter had many nice homes and apartment dwellings in this view. Most people living here didn't appreciate all the activity. In this early view, you can see a more sparse housing population, and back in 1913 it was almost bare. But human nature often disregards the issue of who was there first when it comes to residential areas. Some were even concerned that these freight trains were carrying munitions. Here, a borrowed Alameda Belt Alco diesel with an OT electric picks up another train. Other customers of the formerly Key System-owned Oakland terminal had freight loads delivered to sidings branching off the Key System main lines. This 12th and Poplar customer is the old shredded wheat plant on the Key System's A line. Here we find OT's leased 442 switching empties for loads. Boxcars full of products will soon be heading to America's breakfast tables. We're back in the SN yard with number 653 leaving its train that will now wait for the OT to show up and pull it down 40th Street. After that, trailing 660 and a spoke-wheeled caboose could be put away. A last look at some of the shops at Oakland before we head for the main line out of town. Freight trains used Shafter Avenue with its steep grade that crossed College Avenue. The offset track was from early plans to possibly run a second track down the street. Engineers had to watch for poorly parked cars and prepare to stop their train. This eastbound train in Rockridge heads up the grade that was rated at 4.6%, compensated for curvature. From Shafter Avenue to Rockridge, the tracks crossed Broadway. Broadway leads to the 1937 completed Caldecott Tunnel that made auto and bus travel to Contra Costa County much easier. This was certainly one factor that killed SN's passenger service. The SN helped bring construction material to build the tunnel. An eastbound crosses Chabot Road. Chabot Elementary School is in the background. Both were named after Anthony Chabot. GE locomotive number 670 on the rear was bought in 1948 from another Western Pacific-owned traction line, the Tidewater Southern. Grinding uphill with a locomotive on each end gave good tractive effort, but added the extra cost of an engineer in both locomotives. On most railroads, a two-locomotive team-up would place both on the front. The fear of a train separation on this horrendous grade placed at least one locomotive on the rear. An eastbound train rounds the curve to head toward Lake Temescal. It has two locomotives on the point and one pushing. The tracks run along the 1869-built Lake Temescal, built by Oakland's water king, Anthony Chabot. This lake started as a reservoir, but eventually became and remains a recreation area. A good-sized train heads down grade, and watch for brake smoke. On the right of the screen is the Pacific Gas and Electric substation. When the small 40th and Shafter Yard was built in 1913, property up in Rock Ridge was bought to build a larger freight yard. Protests by homeowners over this possibility eventually forced the railroad to drop the plan, but the open field for the yard remained undeveloped to the end in 1957. A passing siding along Lake Temescal paralleled Landvale Road that became an early freeway by the 50s. This train is heading toward the Montclair district. Once in Montclair, Thornhill Road will be crossed, but first the tracks will cross over the new freeway. It's rare for trains to stop traffic on the freeway. This peculiar design was allowed with the knowledge that the SN would be torn up in a few more years. The small SN Burney streetcar on the flat car is being sent back to Yuba City. It has been preserved at the Western Railway Museum. This is the trestle that crossed Thornhill Road. The built-up embankment heads toward the shopping area in Montclair. It passes a group of homes and Montclair Elementary School on the east side, and a park built as a WPA project is on the west side. This embankment was eventually leveled. An eastbound passes by Montclair Elementary. A lot of pennies were flattened here over the years. The school still serves the community at this time. The two lead locomotives are 603 and 604. These were the only Sacramento Northern freight units that could be operated as multiple units controlled by one engineer. Notice that only the lead unit has its pantograph up. A third unit with a second engineer is pushing on the rear. The train is crossing over Mountain Boulevard. The concrete abutments survived long after the railroad was removed. A view from the old grocery store parking lot in the town of Montclair shows a train heading east on the back side of the shopping area along Mountain Boulevard. Narrow and twisty Snake Road was well named. These hills were populated with many exclusive homes. This is the small trestle over Snake Road. Behind approaching Baldwin Westinghouse locomotive number 660 is a Sacramento Northern flat car and box car. This train is heading west towards Snake Road from a location near Mellon Cut. Next will be number 661 crossing Snake Road. Back in the train is an outside brace double-door Western Pacific boxcar. .660 again on another day heading to Oakland. We'll go to Shepherd Canyon paralleling Shepherd Canyon Road. The tracks will cross into Contra Costa County using the 3,200-foot-long tunnel. A pre-World War II westbound has 603 and 604 on the rear. Notice the all-black paint used before the early 50s. Orange stripes were added in the 50s for better visibility to help keep people and motorists out of harm's way. Many of these scenes show military loads that point out how the business helped keep the SN going in the Oakland Hills. Once parent Western Pacific laid tracks down Union Street in Oakland to connect to the Oakland terminal, the SN's Oakland Hills line would no longer be needed. Ironically, the WP once considered using the Sacramento Northern Line as its own to save many route miles from Sacramento, but the steep grades and Shafter Avenue alignment would have been difficult to improve. Shepherd Canyon had a stop at Havens with a siding. Havens was named after a local real estate developer. We're heading east into the long tunnel. The tunnel had so many problems with water seepage and soil movement that these retaining walls were built. On the other side of the tunnel will be Eastport and the electric substation that fed the wires. The next substation was at Concord. Here's a view from the 30s with a westbound ducking into the tunnel. The crowded substation and equipment here rested on a small clearing that lacked even a siding. The tracks will parallel Pinehurst Road to Canyon Road. The block signals on the line were used as a safety plus. The SN always relied on dispatching and train orders. We head east to Redwood Canyon with its scattering of homes and a two-room schoolhouse. This area was once a supplier of redwood lumber. After that, the SN ran popular picnic trains to the area. This is watershed territory that drains into the San Leandro Reservoir. This has limited development and preserved its natural state. Past Pinehurst, where the tracks crossed Canyon Road, we'll see the auto bridge that crossed over the tracks. The train runs along the cut to Valley Vista, where a rock quarry existed in the early days. An eastbound drifts downgrade through the large pear orchard toward the small town of Moraga. Back in the 50s, it had one grocery store, a bar that was once a railroad hotel, a station, and a scattering of homes and ranches. Moraga took many decades longer than first planned to develop into a sizable community. By then, the SN itself was gone. It could have been part of the transportation picture for commuters. Moraga was just 11 miles east of Oakland. Another 8.6 miles and you could be in Walnut Creek. This could have been the nucleus of a modern commuter line. Some of the SN's first branch lines disappeared early. The one to Danville and Mount Diablo Park closed in 1924, and the Wallwood branch closed in 1920. We enter the small yard in Moraga that in the early days had a livestock corral loading facility and warehouses to handle fruit loads out of town. 606 was one of two Oakland and Antioch units built with pony trucks in addition to the 4-powered axles. These were at first used to pull fast passenger trains in the Oakland Hills. Sister unit number 605 had the pony wheels removed in the 20s and a framework change. From Moraga, trains passed by St. Mary's College through Burton, West Lafayette, Saranac, and finally Walnut Creek. This is historic 1005 pulling a Hall Scott trailer at West Lafayette over 60 years ago. When the Oakland line was abandoned on February 28, 1957, this became the westernmost point. Within a few months, Walnut Creek was the westernmost point. What remained was an all-diesel freight line isolated from the rest of the SN system. Walnut Creek and Points East had many online customers. One of the good points about having a locomotive on both ends of the train through the Oakland Hills was the extra flexibility switching sidings in Walnut Creek and Points East. When the SN pulled out of Oakland in 1957, the tracks were kept from Walnut Creek for several more years. In front of the Walnut Creek station was a crossover. This westbound slows in front of the Walnut Creek station, and the agent will hand up the train orders to the caboose. Here's a brief look at the station. The earliest settlers called Walnut Creek the Crossroads. A Southern Pacific branch line had an 1891 built station here in Walnut Creek. SP's tracks were crossed over by the second railroad into town, the SN's predecessor, the Oakland and Antioch. One last look at an SN freight heading west, nearly at the Walnut Creek station. Eventually, this portion of the line to Concord was sold to make way for the coming of BART trains. We'll head into the city of Concord that had a population of 6,500 in 1948. Concord had a small yard and some maintenance could be performed there. Industrial sidings brought freight revenue. Here's a look at some track work from both travel directions. This area's orchards were given up to a housing boom over the years. From Concord, trains ran timetable east through place names such as Omer, Clyde, and then Port Chicago. Port Chicago and adjacent areas became heavily industrialized. Rail service was from not only the SN but also competitors Santa Fe and SP. This area had a lot of military activity with a large naval weapons depot near the place name of Clyde on SN timetables. The Santa Fe station at Port Chicago was a place to also get Sacramento Northern tickets since the tracks were very close and parallel there. A Korean War troop train rushes by on the adjacent Santa Fe line. Sacramento Northern tracks crossed under the SP and Santa Fe tracks in what was called a subway. This subway certainly stretches the term's usage. It was built by the Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern to avoid ground-level crossovers and manning a tower. The yellow arrow indicates the location of the open-air subway. The Pittsburgh branch is to the east. The SN had a great deal of business from the Columbia Steel Plant in Pittsburgh. The main line turns compass north to the ferry slips at Mallard on the Suisun Bay shore. The opposite shore is a similar slip at Chips. Our freight train run ends here at Mallard. The rail ferry Ramon was the second ferry, and it replaced the ferry Bridget that burned up in 1914. It was the only known rail ferry equipped with catenary wiring on board. The Ramon was 270 feet long and powered by a 600 horsepower distillate engine. 6 passenger or 10 freight cars could be carried at one time. A bridge across the Carquinez Strait opened to auto, bus, and truck traffic in 1927, weakening the SN's business. The bridge the SN never built could have addressed a big flaw in their system. Any bridge here needs to be high, long, and expensive to avoid disrupting shipping. The Southern Pacific ran rail ferries until 1930 when they built this lengthy bridge. The SP's Martinez to Benicia Bridge replaced its ferry in 1930. This secured SP's position as the dominant player for Sacramento to East Bay traffic. A long freight crosses SP's bridge behind a cab-forward steam locomotive. The ferry connection made the SN's freight and passenger service a little less competitive. When the SP and SN both used ferries, the SN was on an even playing field for Sacramento to Oakland passenger business. The SN had the additional expense of crewing, maintaining, and operating the ferry Ramon to link the two halves of its South End system. It added to the railroad's charm, but not to the bottom line. On August 8, 1954, the Ramon was sold for $5,000 and the slips were shut down. The isolated portion of the SN was linked to Sacramento by trackage rights over the Santa Fe. As the Meteor, westbound train number 3, runs into Concord in the late 30s, we can reflect on a once fine electric system. You have seen 3 historic electric lines that served the Bay Area. The SN lasted the longest by relying on freight. Nothing like it will ever exist again.
This DVD also brings the Southern Pacific Red Trains of the East Bay Area and the Peninsular Railway, with much more history and beautiful historic scenes. Look for it on our website, and thanks for watching.
Sacramento Northern was the 1929 consolidation of the Northern Electric and the San Francisco-Sacramento Railroads, acquired for feeder lines by WP. Under the leadership of Arthur James, the WP added the missing pieces to help generate traffic. The orange lines on the map represent the WP main line. The Sacramento Northern in yellow is traceable to a 1904 trolley line built in Chico, funded by the Diamond Match Company. Ironically, the Match Company was part of the Gould interests at the time. WP and predecessor Northern Electric fought over track locations in 1906 in Marysville. By the 20s, the WP would own the line and bring it into the Sacramento Northern subsidiary. The line from Sacramento down to Oakland, California seems to be more direct than WP's circuitous route, but it had penalties of over 4% grades in the Oakland Hills and a rail ferry ride across the Suisun Bay as a substitute for the bridge that was never built. The SN was a 281-mile line from predecessors that were originally built for passenger operation. All passenger service was phased out by June 1941. SN had built up a healthy freight business by then. The freight operations remained, and the SN would continue to swap trains across the waters at Suisun Bay from the landings built for the Sacramento Northern predecessors. The SN's 1913-built Oakland facility was crammed into about 1.5 square blocks, where freight was exchanged with Key Systems freight operations and later the Oakland terminal. From 40th and Webster Street, we see a Key System transit train running down toward the Oakland shores, past the 40th and Shafter location, and we can see the SN's freight station, office, and car shop in the background. The Key train is taking the tracks also used by SN's passenger trains and freight transfers, as they had a long-term relationship with the Key System. Here's a closer look at the freight station that had a siding to the rear for freight cars and front openings for truck loading when needed. The offices were located in this building, shaped to fit available space. The car repair shop is in the background. The tracks curved off of 40th Street between the office and the tiny triangular depot on a separate piece of pavement. This was the small depot for passenger and baggage use, located on a 2-track curve off of 40th Street. A small interlocking plant was upstairs with 11 levers to control switches. The early plan was to build a larger facility in nearby Rock Ridge, but the local residents organized and blocked the plan, forcing the railroad to be cramped here until the end in 1957, when it was all torn out and reclaimed by urban plans. This view of the yard in the distance is looking down Shafter Avenue, and it shows how close the residential section was to the railroad. The railroad wasn't popular with the locals here. Most of them would never miss the daily freight trains rumbling up and down the street. Just leaving the yard, this freight train is taking Shafter Avenue up to Rock Ridge and the foothills of Oakland. This cab ride in the rear locomotive was in the final days of operation before the track was removed. The last train to leave Oakland was on February 28, 1957, closing out 44 years of electric trains in the Oakland Hills. The typical SN freight train on the south end of the system had a locomotive at each end of the train. We're on the rear locomotive number 653, a 1,000 horsepower GE steeple cab built in the 20s. The 650 class GEs were 5 in number. They were a compact 35 feet long and weighed in at 126,000 pounds. The SN also had a number of Baldwin-built freight units that survived into the 50s that worked this line, as well as switching freight under lease to the Oakland Terminal Railway. Grades in the Oakland Hills exceeded 4%, and they felt better about the safety of push and pull power to prevent trains from breaking in two. Power at both ends also simplified switching at the various industries in Walnut Creek, Concord, Pittsburgh and Port Chicago. The run through the Oakland Hills past Moraga and out to Walnut Creek had no industries to generate traffic in the later years. Once the WP completed its own connection in Oakland to the Oakland Terminal Yard by laying track down Union Street in 1957, the SN's south end would be drastically cut back. The town of Walnut Creek provided a few locations to switch freight. The SN once handled walnut loads from sidings near the Walnut Creek freight station. By having the locomotive at both ends, the crew can work sidings pointing in either direction. Number 652 was eventually donated to the California Railroad Museum at Rio Vista Junction, California. The trailing unit, number 653, was donated to the Orange Empire Rail Museum in Paris, California, still in operating condition. The identical number 654 was also donated to the California Railroad Museum, where it continues to run for visiting rail fans. These are the only remaining freight locomotives from a large roster. Sadly, the SN's Baldwins that had offset ends like the Pacific Electric freight motors were all scrapped in the 50s. This fan trip is leaving Concord, California, powered by number 1005, a car built in the teens and sold to the predecessor Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern, and eventually to Key System during World War II. The Bay Area Electric Railroaders Association bought the car in 1951 to be used for fan trips and preservation. The rear car is Salt Lake in Utah number 751, a reminder of an era on the SN that sported luxury parlor cars that could keep passengers in comfort all the way into Oakland. From there, they could continue to San Francisco on a Key System ferry. The fan trip is returning to 40th and Shafter, down Shafter Avenue, crossing College Avenue. The track here is offset to one side from early plans to double-track the line. These plans never materialized due to objections from homeowners along Shafter Avenue. Traffic volume was low enough where it probably never really mattered. The heavier freight trains were more of a problem for residents than the passenger trains. After a stop at the depot, the Sacramento Northern's pre-war trains would take the Key System tracks down 40th Street to the Bridge Rail Yard and continue to the San Francisco side of the bay. When the Bay Bridge was open to rail traffic, an SN train could share the bridge with SP's IER cars and Key System's silver and orange units. The SP and SN trains both ended just before World War II, leaving the bridge rails to Key alone. Even the Key System gave its business to buses by 1958. The Loop and Terminal building was built to complement the Bay Bridge, and it was a setback for the ferry operators. Passengers and commuters that flowed in and out of this busy terminal had a great transportation system on the west side of the bay too. The SP was nearby with a large station, and the cable cars and the Muni system could take you anywhere within the city. The WP had its headquarters here in a large building in the background showing the WP and Feather sign. The WP had a small isolated amount of track in San Francisco they reached by rail barge. Back on the East Bay side, the Key System ran by the Santa Fe's small yard near Hollis Street. The Santa Fe and the WP were co-owners of the Oakland Terminal switching line, and they had other ways of cooperating to balance the regional near dominance of the powerful Southern Pacific. After the tracks were removed in the Oakland Hills, the isolated part of the Sacramento Northern system gained trackage rights on the Santa Fe from West Pittsburgh to Stockton, and the rail ferry operation was ended, and the expense of it. Diesels had taken over everywhere on the SN except one segment remaining under wire in the Twin Cities of Marysville and Yuba City. The last 3 GE freight motors were there until 1964, when a long-term electric power contract ended with the Pacific Gas and Electric Company. The power had a minimum billing, whether used or not. GE 652 was already partly dismantled to keep sisters 653 and 654 running. The end of any electric Sacramento Northern operation finally came, but not until a few last runs under wire, this trip being made in a San Francisco Muni car number 178, which is about as far from home as it's ever been. It gave riders one last look at what streetcar service was like before it ended on the Sacramento Northern's Yuba City line in 1942. This car now resides at the California Railroad Museum in Rio Vista Junction. The SN really started to dieselize during World War II with small GE diesels that soon needed help from old but larger units inherited from parent WP. One of the surviving trains was the steel train from the United States Steel Plant in Pittsburg, California, on a now isolated section of SN track to WP's Stockton Yard. The SN used trackage rights over the Santa Fe to Stockton. This train was long ago an SN train, but now it has been inherited through WP to the Union Pacific, shown here running on Santa Fe tracks. Over the years, these trains had grown in size and were partly to blame for the collapse of the Lisbon Trestle in 1951. That moment in time accelerated the demise of electric operation on the Sacramento Northern, and now the SN itself has disappeared with the WP into UP's 1982 system.
Imagine an electric railroad that once stretched over 180 miles from Oakland to Chico, California. That would be this Sacramento Northern that ended in a tiny yard in a cramped residential area. Be sure to like and subscribe and check into our website at cspmovies.com. And thanks for watching.
The Sacramento Northern was owned by the Western Pacific. The SN was bought in the 1920s as a feeder line and as an alternate route into Oakland. Passenger operation ended in 1940, but the SN was always cooperative with railfans. This was one of the many fan trips over the SN. It was recorded on 8mm movie film by the late Harry DeMoro when he was 15. Harry went on to a long career as a journalist, historian, and photographer. You can see his early work here on a June 1954 fan trip organized by the Bay Area Electric Railroad Association. The trip started in the small SN yard in Oakland at 40th and Shafter. The trip ran to the end of the Pittsburgh branch with a short trip to the rail ferry slip at Mallard. The return trip was from Mallard back to Oakland. The SN used electric freight motors to haul daily freight trains between Oakland and West Pittsburgh. Several SN freight motors were leased to the Oakland terminal. They ran down the Key Systems tracks to the OT yard and the Oakland Army base. The OT was owned by the Key System until World War II, when it was sold to the WP and the Santa Fe. Notice the extra-large pantograph on leased number 442 to reach the Key Systems higher catenary under the SP underpass on the way to the Key Systems bridge yard. The green line is SN's track to its 40th and Shafter yard, tied to the Key Systems 40th Street line. The Oakland terminal freights used this streetcar line as a connection to the freight yard. The SN trains used Shafter Avenue crossing College Avenue for a run up into Rock Ridge. Passing by Lake Temescal, the tracks ran through Montclair and Shepherd Canyon to a long tunnel. The SN yard was energized to 600 volts DC to match that of the connecting Key Systems voltage on their 40th Street line. 2 blocks up Shafter Avenue, the SN voltage was raised to 1500 volts DC to deal with the steeper grades ahead. These two SN motors have ended their westward run into Oakland, and they dropped their pantographs to tie up in the small SN yard. Before the fan trip left, Harry caught a leased OT freight motor running a short way up Shafter Avenue to back a single Pennsylvania Railroad boxcar into the small Sacramento Northern yard. The OT's connections to the area's Army and naval bases kept this part of the SN busy during the 3-year Korean War. Number 442 was built in 1920 and scrapped by 1955. It looks like freight traffic is rather thin today. The boost in traffic from the Korean War was already over by this June 1954 fan trip day. The armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, almost a year before. This fan trip used a 1913 vintage Hall Scott. It was formerly number 1020 when the SN had passenger service. It was originally built as a trailer, but motorized by 1915. Several passenger units were kept for maintenance of way use after passenger service ended in 1940. The trip was arranged for SN fans by the Bay Area Electric Railroad Association, still active today. We leave the 40th and Shafter Yard and station to head up Shafter Avenue. The homeowners along Shafter never cared much for the trains, and they were eager to see the line disappear from their otherwise quiet residential setting. The tracks were completed into Oakland by 1913, when it was far less developed. The southern half of the SN was known as the Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern back then. The OA&E was reorganized in 1920 as the San Francisco-Sacramento Railroad Company. By 1928, the line was bought by the Western Pacific and merged with the Northern Electric to form the Sacramento Northern Railway. Most of SN's trackage was on private right-of-way. The stretch from Rock Ridge to Oakland on a city street was an unfortunate thorn in everyone's side. The cramped yard at 40th and Shafter was going to be replaced by a larger one in Rock Ridge on a vacant field. This plan never materialized due to shaky finances in the early years of the OA&E. The grade here reaches beyond the 4% mark in spots as we head toward Lake Temescal. We duck under Broadway near the edge of Lake Temescal. Long freight trains heading timetable east often had to double the hill back in Rock Ridge and reassemble the train at Temescal siding due to the steep ruling grade. SN freights were required to have a locomotive at both ends of all trains, even if only a single boxcar and caboose. This was to prevent a car from uncoupling and racing back down Shafter Avenue out of control. It happened once in the early years before the rule was set. MW302 crosses Snake Road with Montclair Village in the background. The tracks curve through a great excavation in the hillside to approach Shepherd Canyon. We'll parallel Park Boulevard until we near Saroni Drive. There, the tracks enter a 3,200-foot-long tunnel. Around the middle of the tunnel, the train will leave Alameda County and enter Contra Costa County. This tunnel was built into a hillside that naturally drained an abundance of water out the east end. This was one of the nuisances to live with. The east side was called Eastport. It had the substation that fed the western half of the south end. The next substation was at Concord. Here we see MW302 leaving the east end of the tunnel in a photo run by. Eastport had a collection of small structures and a number of fruit trees planted by SN's workers. Parked off to the left of the track is one of SN's tower cars to work on the overhead catenary wiring. When the line closed in 1957, the Eastport clearing was soon engulfed with brush and vegetation, making this a difficult place to reach. The tracks paralleled Pinehurst Road into Redwood Canyon. The Redwood Canyon was a popular picnic site for the old OA&E passenger trains in the early years. The tracks continue out past Pinehurst, where they crossed over Canyon Road on a small trestle on the way to Valley Vista. Less than a mile further east, the tracks crossed again, but this time under Canyon Road. This was shot from the small bridge that once ran over the tracks. Just past Moraga, we can see part of the huge pear orchard in the distance. We run by St. Mary's College with its small mission-style station. In this 1954 scene, it was still standing after passenger trains had ended in 1940. The distance from St. Mary's to Lafayette is about 4.3 miles. We pass by a siding at a long-neglected station at Lafayette. It once loaded milk, produce, and passengers in an earlier era. 5.5 miles later and past the town of Walnut Creek, we reach Las Juntas, where the Sacramento Northern crossed and occasionally interchanged freight with the Southern Pacific. This very rare chance moment meeting was also a photo in James Harrison's recent Sacramento Northern Gallery book. This movie film shot angle is the matching photo scene in the book. SP had the priority at this crossing junction since SP had been there from 1891, long before the OA&E built their tracks across SP rails. The SP's San Ramon branch ran through San Ramon and Walnut Creek to Avon, halfway between Martinez and Port Chicago. One thing you'll notice is the fine maintenance of Sacramento Northern's track. This is remarkable since only one freight train in each direction per day was the norm in the last few years on the SN's Oakland to Walnut Creek section. The Sacramento Northern operation from Oakland out to a point near Walnut Creek closed in 1957 after the WP made new connections with the Oakland terminal down Union Street back in Oakland. This eliminated transferring Western Pacific freight cars bound for the Oakland Army Base at WP's Sacramento Yard to the Sacramento Northern for the trip through the Oakland Hills on the SN line. The SN carried out operations from its Pittsburgh yard to Walnut Creek and its agricultural sidings for a few more years, but this was an all-diesel operation by then. The catenary all came down on the south end in March 1957. By 1964, the main line from Walnut Creek to Concord was sold to the Bay Area Rapid Transit Operation, known as BART. You might be astonished by the underdeveloped look of all this territory of about a half-century ago. At Clyde, we crossed the Bay Point and Clayton, a short line around the Port Chicago area. The SN's tracks turned east at Port Chicago and ran past McAvoy, where the SN paralleled the SP and the Santa Fe. A stop there is just in time to record the Santa Fe San Francisco Chief. This post-World War II train is a technological contrast to our 1913 vintage Hall Scott car. Sacramento Northern crossed under the Southern Pacific and Santa Fe railroads to head toward its ferry slip at Mallard. The ferry connection across the Suisun Bay was eliminated in 1954, about the time of this filming. From then on, a trackage rights arrangement with the Santa Fe connected SN trains to Stockton. All this was precipitated by the 1951 collapse of the long arcade trestle on the other side of the Suisun Bay. The trestle was rebuilt, but without electric overhead. The line from Chips to Sacramento was dieselized. This left the Contra Costa and Alameda County line an isolated electric section. By 1954, the ferry was retired from service. The trackage rights over Santa Fe to Stockton and the WP to Sacramento reconnected the south end segment to the rest of the Sacramento Northern. The SN predecessor, Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern, never really made it to Antioch or east of there either. Antioch is just east of East Pittsburgh. The early franchise expired before available resources could lay rails into Antioch. Actually, it was a blunder that haunted the OA&E's management. Once the trackage rights were secured over the Santa Fe, the Sacramento Northern trains finally made it to Antioch, but as a guest on someone else's rails. The Western Pacific line from Oakland to Sacramento took a roundabout route to Niles, Altamont Pass, Stockton, and finally Sacramento. The Sacramento Northern line simply drilled through the Oakland Hills and headed in the more direct route towards Sacramento by crossing the Suisun Bay at the ferry slip at Mallard. The SN had the most direct line to Sacramento, and its parent WP once considered converting it into an alternate WP line into Oakland. The steep grades in the Oakland Hills and the poor situation using key system tracks to access industries in Oakland eventually caused the plan to fade away. Another plan that never was carried out was to replace the ungainly ferry crossing with a bridge across the bay from Mallard to Chips on the other side. This would have made the SN far more competitive with the Southern Pacific. The Sacramento Northern was once the country's longest electric interurban line, forged together by the union of the Northern Electric and the old Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern lines. The South End system, built as the OA&E, represented the last great building of this type of line in California. The brief optimistic flurry of electric railroad building around 1900 was eventually killed off by the rapid rise of the truck, automobile, and paved road. These forces could deprive revenue from short-haul lines such as the OA&E. By merging and coming under the banner of larger steam roads, such as the Western Pacific, some of these electric lines were able to serve a renewed and extended purpose, although in a long, slow death by shrinkage. Today, several small pieces of the SN still survive, but as part of the Union Pacific system that bought the Western Pacific and all its feeder lines. The return trip back to Oakland stopped at Moraga to add a freight locomotive on the point. This was to provide braking safety on the steep grade from the tunnel at Havens to 40th and Shafter. 605 was one of the two motors bought by the early OA&E to pull passenger trailers. The Sacramento Northern was the 1929 consolidation of the Northern Electric and the San Francisco-Sacramento Railroads, acquired for feeder lines by WP. Under the leadership of Arthur James, the WP added the missing pieces to help generate traffic. The orange lines on the map represent the WP main line. The Sacramento Northern in yellow is traceable to a 1904 trolley line built in Chico, funded by the Diamond Match Company. Ironically, the Match Company was part of the Gould interests at the time. WP and predecessor Northern Electric fought over track locations in 1906 in Marysville. By the 20s, the WP would own the line and bring it into the Sacramento Northern subsidiary. The line from Sacramento down to Oakland, California seems to be more direct than WP's circuitous route, but it had penalties of over 4% grades in the Oakland Hills and a rail ferry ride across the Sassoon Bay as a substitute for the bridge that was never built. The SN was a 281-mile line from predecessors that were originally built for passenger operation. All passenger service was phased out by June 1941. SN had built up a healthy freight business by then. The freight operations remained, and the SN would continue to swap trains across the waters at Sassoon Bay from the landings built for the Sacramento Northern predecessors. The SN's 1913-built Oakland facility was crammed into about 1.5 square blocks, where freight was exchanged with Key Systems freight operations and later the Oakland terminal. From 40th and Webster Street, we see a Key System transit train running down toward the Oakland shores, past the 40th and Shafter location, and we can see the SN's freight station, office, and car shop in the background. The Key train is taking the tracks also used by SN's passenger trains and freight transfers, as they had a long-term relationship with the Key System. Here's a closer look at the freight station that had a siding to the rear for freight cars and front openings for truck loading when needed. The offices were located in this building, shaped to fit available space. The car repair shop is in the background. The tracks curved off of 40th Street between the office and the tiny triangular depot on a separate piece of pavement. This was the small depot for passenger and baggage use, located on a two-track curve off of 40th Street. A small interlocking plant was upstairs with 11 levers to control switches. The early plan was to build a larger facility in nearby Rock Ridge, but the local residents organized and blocked the plan, forcing the railroad to be cramped here until the end in 1957, when it was all torn out and reclaimed by urban plans. This view of the yard in the distance is looking down Shafter Avenue, and it shows how close the residential section was to the railroad. The railroad wasn't popular with the locals here. Most of them would never miss the daily freight trains rumbling up and down the street. Just leaving the yard, this freight train is taking Shafter Avenue up to Rock Ridge and the foothills of Oakland. This cab ride in the rear locomotive was in the final days of operation before the track was removed. The last train to leave Oakland was on February 28, 1957, closing out 44 years of electric trains in the Oakland Hills. The typical SN freight train on the south end of the system had a locomotive at each end of the train. We're on the rear locomotive number 653, a 1,000 horsepower GE steeple cab built in the 20s. The 650 class GEs were 5 in number. They were a compact 35 feet long and weighed in at 126,000 pounds. The SN also had a number of Baldwin-built freight units that survived into the 50s that worked this line, as well as switching freight under lease to the Oakland Terminal Railway. Grades in the Oakland Hills exceeded 4%, and they felt better about the safety of push and pull power to prevent trains from breaking in two. Power at both.
Nearly all of the Greater Bay Area residents are totally unaware of a very different look of things in the 1940s and 50s. A great transportation system was buried and forgotten as quickly as possible. Let's look back to grander times there.
The Bay Bridge in the background just linked this Key System train from Piedmont in the East Bay to San Francisco's Trans-Bay Terminal at 1st and Mission Streets. The Bay Bridge and the new terminal replaced the Key System's ferry boats in 1939. The terminal featured an elevated loop that ran through a building over 1,200 feet long. It was built to accommodate Key's trains as long as 8 articulated units. The Trans-Bay Terminal had great connections to Muni streetcars to extend the commuter's trip. Of all the electric trains you will see, the Municipal Railway is the sole survivor. The orange loop lines in this diagram show the streetcar tracks that connected to the frontage of the Trans-Bay Terminal. Buses back and forth from the East Bay use this terminal as a replacement for the Key System's tracks. East Bay Key System riders were long ago placed on the lower deck of the Bay Bridge. We'll see that the 2 tracks were on the lower deck indexed to the bridge's south side. The upper deck was for auto traffic, with 3 lanes in each direction. Since the bidirectional traffic was only separated by a painted line, head-on accidents could greatly constrict the flow of auto traffic. Our train is approaching the Trans-Bay Terminal to drop off passengers on its upper floor. The Trans-Bay Terminal may have been one of the worst problems for the bridge-era trains. According to the late Transit Authority and general historian Harry DeMoro, the terminal could not support the level of commuters in rush hour periods that the old ferry building had accomplished so well for so many years. He suggested that they should have studied it more as a functioning model. He pointed out that passengers wouldn't use the lower level to wait for their trains. It was poorly lit, and it rumbled constantly from the trains on the upper level. As a result, they would tend to wait on the upper level platforms and create interference with passengers trying to get off arriving trains. Each articulated unit had 2 wide doors per side. Usually only the trailing section's door was used for boarding and offloading. But at the Trans-Bay Terminal, both doors were frequently used to speed up passenger flow. Getting trains back underway was critical in rush hour periods. Leaving the Transbay Terminal, we circulate around the elevated loop and head back to the Bay Bridge. Notice that the pantographs are down here, and the trains were powered by outside third rail. The overhead wiring was originally built here to operate at a higher 1200 volts for the SP Red trains and the Sacramento Northern interurban trains. Both these lines quit their service before the start of World War II. These interior scenes show clean and spacious accommodations. The large windows gave riders beautiful vistas while crossing the bay, but these windows could not be opened. On hot days, usually combined with tobacco smoke, this and the lack of air conditioning often made these units uncomfortable. The smoking section with rattan seats was in the front. The rear half of the articulated unit had leather seats and was for non-smoking patrons. Below we see an SP ferry boat. Until 1958, they ferried long-distance rail passengers from San Francisco to the Oakland Mole to catch trains such as the SP Shasta Daylight. The Keys Bridge trains were underpowered, a frequent complaint of their overall design. As the bridge gained height to clear ships below, the Keys westbound trains struggled with the grade. Eastbounds, such as the train we are on now, had early brake fading problems on the long descent from Yerba Buena Island to the bridge's end. This was remedied with a retrofit to the entire fleet. Before World War II, the SP Red trains and the SN, or Sacramento Northern interurban trains, shared these rails and this bridge yard in Emeryville. Only the SN's trains had sufficient power to make the westbound climb up the bridge effortless. We'll see more on the SN later on. Much of the land east of the Bay Bridge is landfill, shown by the purple line. The shore of Emeryville was extended far out into the marshy swamps and the bay itself, largely by numerous railroad projects built since 1900. The war redefined another part of the East Bay shoreline when the United States Navy built the Alameda Naval Air Station. The Key System was a large player in the war effort. We looked through many of the issues printed during the war years of the Key System's company magazine called The Keynoter, and we saw hundreds of articles about their employees that left to serve in all branches of the service. Most came back, but far too many did not. The company built a large plaque simply titled Honor Roll. It listed all the Keys men and women that served in the military. During the war, women worked as ticket takers on many of the Key System's trains to allow more younger men to join various branches of the service. The Key System's buses were an important part of the transit scene by World War II. Women drivers replaced many of the younger male bus drivers that had left for military service. The early war years became a scramble to organize all available resources for moving commuters without wasting gasoline and tires for personal auto travel. This Sacramento Northern car, number 1005, was one of 5 retired units pressed back into service. 5 of these former Sacramento Northern interurban cars that were by then owned by the Toll Bridge Authority were used on the Key System's Berkeley or F line, as the Key System was short of units. Their SN green color was replaced by the old Key System orange. These were nicknamed the City of Berkeley by its patrons. In 1946, the Key System was sold to National City Lines. This holding company has been criticized ever since for converting many American electric rail lines to bus operation. In short order, the orange and silver gave way to the common green and yellow of the NCL colors that reached into countless streetcar and electric lines nationwide. The main lines of the Bridge Railway, shown here, were supplemented by a wealth of city streetcar lines, shown in green. It all worked together, but it was best suited for an era before the family car. The green lines represent the zenith of the connecting trolley or streetcar lines that gradually adapted to bus travel beginning in the 1920s. Another part of the Keys' participation in the war was in special streetcars that promoted the idea of blood donation to support the troops injured in the course of the war effort. The 6th line ran from Thousand Oaks in Berkeley all the way to a loop in downtown Oakland near 8th and Franklin. This early 1900s scene and the limited urban housing compares with the streetcar 10 line of the late 40s. Nearby at the bottom of the dip are turnouts for the Piedmont C line trains. Streetcar 932 was one of many ordered in 1922 from American Car Company as units 900 through 954. The K line often used streetcars in multiple unit operation. This Berkeley line was the only streetcar line with transfer privileges to the bridge train service. In earlier years, the F line ended at the south end of the K line. When the SP Red trains quit in 1941, the Key system extended its F line service out to North Bray as shown here. A 5-line streetcar boards passengers while an F-line bridge train passes by. Another 5-line streetcar on University at Shattuck continues its run. The 5-line ran from 3rd and University to 1st and Broadway, nearly 8 miles. Much of the 5-line used Telegraph Avenue. Car 954 was the last in the first order of 900 series cars from American Car Company. Car 820 was built as a prototype for rebuilding the 800 series cars to resemble the newer 900 series cars. Car 801 was one of 18 built in the Emeryville shops in 1919 to 1920. Streetcar 801 just crossed the E line on its 5-line, moments ahead of a bridge train from Claremont heading to San Francisco. It's easy to see how streetcars crisscrossing the East Bay were a poor mix with growing auto traffic by the late 1940s. The B line shared some trackage with the 18 and the 12-line streetcars. The A-line bridge trains shared some trackage past Lake Merritt Dam with a number of streetcar lines. Nearby was the 18th Street and 3rd Avenue streetcar barn. Bridge trains labeled A1 once terminated here for connections to the streetcar grid. This sad scrapping procession is led by 705, then 389, followed by an unidentified unit, and finally 398. The flat car motor 1208 is pushing this group of retired streetcars around in Emeryville for the last insult of termination and scrapping of the streetcar lines in the East Bay by 1948. Plucky 1208, dating from 1897, was described by the late Harry DeMoro as having an insect-like appearance, a very apt description. Back in the late 40s and 50s, streetcars were scrapped in this typical ignominious style of burning to salvage whatever steel residue could be reclaimed. By modern pollution standards, this form of reclamation would be scorned if not prosecuted. The crunch of the National City Lines, or NCL Holding Company, that took over the numerous interurban and streetcar lines post-World War II, has fueled debate for decades. The narrow-gauge Los Angeles Railway was another example of the National City Lines takeover after World War II. This line dated back to the efforts of Henry Huntington, the nephew of Southern Pacific's Collis P. Huntington. Henry bought and built electric lines in the early 20th century, and there are many parallels to Borax Smith's key system strategy. The Huntington Standard streetcar design was an influence on many streetcars used out west, including early key system streetcars. The Los Angeles Railway made every effort to accommodate its flagging patrons. The more streamlined and smooth-riding PCC cars, introduced in the late 30s, hoped to stem the tide of patron loss to the family automobile. The LA Railway managed to extend its life into the early 1960s. All the while, bus service encroached into this historic railway until it too was finished with rail service. The yellow, green, and white colors of the LA Railway and the new colors for the post-war key system was no accident of coincidence. This was the common color theme imposed by the National City Lines for rail lines gobbled up around the country. Ever since, barrels of ink have been used to document the anti-rail and pro-bus attitude of the National City Lines after these scenes were taken. Many streetcar bodies were sold to hot dog stand owners, farm owners for field worker housing, storage sheds, and many other enterprises. You can see the new colors that the NCL placed on many of the Keys streetcars in only 2 years. Many also retired in the old orange color. Now, only the heavy bridge rail units were left to use the remaining rails. Long ago, this area was mostly a swampland. A B-line train turns off of 22nd Street to head down Poplar Street. In about 18 minutes, it will be in San Francisco. This B-line train is about to cross Adeline and run past a factory with an electrified freight siding that ran into the actual building. This is on Grand Avenue between Harrison and Webster Streets. This is Grand Avenue at Euclid. Here's a brief view of Lake Merritt that has long been one of Oakland's bright spots.
Look for the entire DVD video production on our website, cspmovies.com. And thanks for watching.
Southern Pacific Line, built by Harriman, was the SP Red trains of the Oakland, Alameda, and Berkeley lines. These electric lines were converted from early steam-powered local lines in the East Bay. SP's large fleet of ferry boats complemented the rail lines to link the East Bay to San Francisco in the days before the Bay Bridge. We cover the Alameda and Oakland moles, as locals called them, where electric rails met the ferry slips until 1939. From that point on, your ticket carried you over the bay on the Bay Bridge rail lines to the San Francisco terminal, shared with the Sacramento Northern and rival Key System trains. We cover the track realignments made for the Bay Bridge service that was sadly only active until the 1941 abandonment. Visit the upper deck of the 16th Street station, down to Dutton Avenue on the 7th Street line. It's just one of the highlights of both onboard and trackside action that you'll enjoy. We also bring extensive coverage of the Sacramento Northern's South End section in the Alameda and Contra Costa counties. Visit the cramped and interesting railroad yard in the middle of an Oakland residential and shopping area. See freight trains assembled on city streets. This video brings those wonderful electrics of GE and Baldwin Westinghouse back to life. This line vanished in 1957, but from historic film restored for this video, it's back after a very long wait. See passenger and freight action. See special coverage of the Oakland Terminal Freight Line. The Oakland Terminal leased SN's electric freight locomotives to deliver freight to Oakland's Army base and industries. Graphics and numerous maps keep you informed, bringing better context of each scene. We follow and ride many freight trains out from Oakland through the hills, canyons, and orchards. Visit Walnut Creek and its station and switch some freight. See Concord with passenger and freight trains. Next was Port Chicago with its heavy industrial zones and large munitions depot. Ride through the subway crossing under the Southern Pacific and Santa Fe tracks on the way to the only known rail ferry under catenary wiring. The ferry connection was a substitute for the bridge that was never built. It was perhaps the biggest flaw and at the same time the most charming aspect of the 185-mile-long Sacramento Northern. After a long wait, these rare electric rail visions are now available for viewing.
Watch this preview of our 2 DVDs that detail the wonderful history of a great Bay Area system that was swept away by 1958.
The first of 2 volumes of the Key System scrapbook covers the years up to the end of World War II. East Bay residents once could ride the Bay Bridge from many points in Alameda County to the heart of San Francisco. The Bay Bridge also made this task easier for automobile owners, which would ultimately bring the end